I'm making this video because I want to talk about Wuthering Heights. Specifically, I want to talk about the Broadview edition of Wuthering Heights and how I read this novel for the first time a few years ago. And when I read it, I had a very specific bias and a very specific perspective. Versus now, reading it, of course, for the upcoming movie, I had a very different perspective, specifically with characters and the ending of the novel and sort of the overarching themes and critique of the novel. And so I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to have a conversation and I wanted to process and understand why my perspective changed and understand where the bias takes place within the novel in hopes that it helps someone else recognize this as well and sort of understand the ways in which this novel is not one that can be read once, but has to be read multiple times to actually fully understand it and comprehend it. I have a few points that I've written down that I would like to talk about specifically, because I probably would forget if I didn't write them down. So to start off with, I want to mention characters. Specifically, I want to talk about Catherine and Heathcliff. To start off with, I think we have to talk about Catherine. The whole novel is about her. She's the complete main character of the novel, yet she's also one of the most hated characters. I took a class, it was a British novel class, and in the class, everyone was discussing how much they really disliked Catherine and how much they hated her, and I just thought that was such an interesting take. I think because when I read this the first time, I also felt the same way, but, reading this again for the second time, I was sorely mistaken in a sense. I think I started to understand the depth to her that doesn't really show prominently the first time around. And when you read it the first time around, I think that a lot of bias comes into play, especially because I think that the way that our society has structured this novel has put it in a moment of pop culture where, Heathcliff is idolized and Catherine is hated. And I think that's not true. I think that there's more depth to her character than just being a hateful, spiteful character, because she's not spiteful. She's just a teenage girl. She's a 17-year-old girl who had to make a choice in life, and I think that often gets overlooked. Imagine when you were 17 years old and you had to make the choices she had to make in the society that she's in. I think it's 19th century British social world, and I think that it's not an easy world to live in, and we forget our privilege as the modern reader when we read her character and we critique her with our viewpoints and our mentality and understanding. And it's really important to take a step backwards and sort of understand where she comes from, because there's so much more depth to her character than what can be seen in just the surface level content. And I think that Emily Bronte made it that way on purpose. I do feel as though she's very misunderstood, and it's very much the comparison of if a woman did this versus if a man did this. You look at a lot of the stuff Heathcliff did, and he did 10 times worse things within the novel, and his character isn't judged in the same way and critiqued in the same way that Catherine's is, and it's very disappointing. It's very sad. I think that I wish we would look at her with more of the same open-mindedness and, I guess, nuanced perspective as we look at Heathcliff with. And in that same note, I want to transition to talking about Heathcliff. So one thing about Heathcliff that I have really started to notice, especially after the film came out and having conversations with friends about the novel and about the movie, is that there's some innate thing that makes Heathcliff so charming, and readers are so drawn to him and idolize him in a way that I'm just so curious about, because I think the first time I read this, I did not understand really what was super great about him. I mean, obviously, when you have someone like Jacob Elordi playing him, it's a very different perspective and it's a very different story, but there was something about Mr. Heathcliff within the novel that I couldn't get behind, and especially my second time around reading it, I just was full of hatred towards him, but I also felt like I understood him in a weird way because I could see myself within him. And so I think that after he left Wuthering Heights, he sort of became this well-educated, well-versed individual, and how it was like through his education and his literacy that he like became this abusive, powerful being that he is or was within the novel, which I'll touch on more later. But I think that because of this education and power that he gained from his knowledge and his leaving Wuthering Heights, there's a certain amount of aura and mystique in his stoic character that sort of takes place and takes form within that. And so, you know, his past is very mysterious. It's very unknown where he came from. All we really know is that Mr. Earnshaw was like, here's this kid. He was just on the streets of Liverpool, you know, take him in. He's my son now. He's one of my own. But again, never being addressed as one of the Earnshaws, being Heathcliff as his given name. And also sort of the unknownness of when he left Wuthering Heights, what his character was doing, how his character came into wealth. It gives him a certain amount of aura, and it gives him a certain amount of attractiveness, I guess I would say. I can't think of a better word right now, but I think it's something about this unknowingness within him just gives him that allure that draws us as the readers in, wants us to become curious and know more about him. I think that when I also was writing my analyzation of this, and when I was rereading the novel for the second time, I started to understand what I found was the thing that made him most charming in a sense. Because although I might not have found him charming myself, I could still understand why people find him charming and why they find him alluring. With that in mind, I think that the one thing that makes him the most charming and what makes him the most attractive, I guess I would say, or aura-filling, is his undying and innate passion for Catherine. I think that at the end of the day, that's his biggest appeal, is his undying love for Catherine. I mean, let's look on page 175 within the novel. You know, this is right after Catherine has just passed away. And so Heathcliff states, "May she wake in a torment," he cried, with a frightful vehemence, stamping his foot and groaning with a sudden paroxysm of ungovernable passion. "Why, she's a liar to the end. Where is she? Not there in heaven, not perished. Where? Oh, you said you cared for nothing for my sufferings. And I pray one prayer. I repeat it till my tongue stiffens. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you? Haunt me then. The murdered do haunt their murderers. I believe I know ghosts have wandered on earth. Be with me. Take any form. Drive me mad. Only do not leave me in the abyss, where I cannot find you. Oh God, it is unutterable, unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul." And then he basically dashes and smashes his head on a tree in a mad rage. I think that there's something so alluring about the idea that here is this man who would do anything for the one he loves, and there's something that draws us into his character. It doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, you're drawn in, you care because you can understand, you can feel his caring passion. I think especially because his character was so stoic and didn't really have much to care about, to see him have feelings in this way was so important for our obsession with him, and I think it is the driver of all things. Moving on from talking about Heathcliff and Catherine's character, because I do think they're really interesting, but I also think it's a perspective that I have. I think that I'm sharing one perspective I have of these characters, and there's no one right way to analyze them. And I think that there's no one right way to analyze the novel as well. And so it's important to note that with everything I'm saying. It's just my personal opinion, and it's just the way I interpreted the novel, especially because this is my second time reading it. So I just wanted to point to the things that I noticed had shifted and changed within my own internal bias and my own perspective. And so with that, I kind of want to talk about the critique of the novel, or what I understood as the critique of the novel. So the sort of interpretation or overarching theme within the novel that I found was the idea of the societal world, specifically of the British 19th century, which I mentioned earlier. And I have a few examples of ways in which I saw this through the novel that I want to point to. So first, I want to talk about how the fact that this novel takes place in a social world that women don't have the option to choose to marry for love, but they're rather forced to marry to be able to live a decent life. And so I specifically want to point to page 102 when Catherine is having that internal... No, it's actually external. When Catherine's talking with Nellie specifically about why she's choosing to marry Edgar Linton over Heathcliff. And so she says something on this subject because she goes to Nellie for advice and she goes to Nellie for her opinion, and Nellie kind of shuts her down. And I think that for me, this point in the novel, going back to when I was talking about Catherine, was the first time I really noticed that she is just a 17-year-old girl just trying to figure out her life. And she says here on page 102, "It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now, so he shall never know how I love him. And that's not because he's handsome, Nellie, but because he's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same." Everyone knows that famous line within the novel, but I specifically want to talk about the fact that Kathy was such an intelligent teenager, and she understood that there was no life in this societal world where her and Heathcliff could exist at the same time, and where the two of them could live a proper life, or not even a proper life, but live any type of life. And so I think that this was one of the moments when it's sort of critiquing the world that it's built in, saying there is no place for love and there is no place for our love in this world, so I can't marry him. I have no choice but to marry Edgar. And so I found that part really, really important in the novel, and I found it really a turning point where I started to understand that this wasn't just a novel about love, that it was also about the world that it's built in, and the ways in which we inhabit spaces, and the ways in which we interact with the people around us. I think that's all I'm going to say on that part, but the next sort of critique of the social world that I saw was also, through this educated version of Heathcliff, and how he treats Isabella, who is Edgar's sister if you don't know, like a property, and how he abuses her, but technically it's within his right, or so the law says, to do as such. And so it's sort of the ways in which the social world allows for this abuse and allows for this ownership over individuals that takes place. And so I'm looking at pages 161 to 162, but I'm gonna basically just read the parts that I think are most important. "She abandoned them under a delusion," he answered, "picturing in me a hero of romance, and expecting unlimited indulgences for my chivalrous devotion. I can hardly regard her in the light of a rational creature. So obstinately has she persisted in forming a fabulous notion of my character, and acting under the false impressions she cherished." He then goes on to say, "I don't perceive the silly smiles and grimaces that provoked me at first, and the senseless incapability of discerning that I was in earnest when I gave her my opinion of her infatuation." And then he basically just talks about how she's a piece of appalling intelligence, and that he's succeeded in making her hate him. And then he says that it was a positive labor of Hercules, meaning it took a long time to get her to hate him. And then he says, "Isabella, are you sure you hate me? If I let you alone for half a day, won't you come sighing and wheedling to me again? I dare say she would rather I had seemed all tenderness before you. It wounds her vanity to have the truth exposed. But I don't care who knows her the passion that was wholly on one side, and I never told her a lie about it. She cannot accuse me of showing one bit of deceitful softness. The first thing she saw me do, on coming out of the grange, was to hang up her little dog, and when she pleaded for it, and the first words I uttered were a wish that I had hanging of every being belonging to her, which is very brutal. Except one. Possibly she took that exception for herself, but no brutality disgusted her. I suppose she had an innate admiration of it, if only her precious person were so secure from injury. He then goes on to call her a pittish, slavish, mean-minded brach, which is female dog word. To dream that I could love her. Tell your master, Nellie, that I never in all of my life met such an abject thing as she. She even disgraces the name of Linton. He then basically goes on to just insult her for like a whole paragraph, and then he says, the nuisance of her presence outweighs the gratification to be derived from tormenting her. And so you can kind of see here this abuse and this brutality that Heathcliff objects to Isabella. I mean, he literally says the words, no brutality disgusted her. And I think here is a really important point, because not only do you see Heathcliff's bruteness and you see his cruelty, but you also see how his education has formed these thoughts and how he's aware of what his rights are as an individual. He knows that he is within his right to abuse her, to kill her dog, to treat her this way, and that no one can do anything to stop it. I think that, him telling Nellie how he never lied about this brute behavior and his mannerisms, and how he's able to treat Isabella as a piece of property, goes to show you that they're critiquing the social world that this novel takes place within. They're saying Heathcliff is not a good guy, and look at all the stuff he can get away with, and look at the fact that he now has come back as this literate, educated person, and he understands that he's allowed to be this cruel being and that no one can stop him. And so I find that really interesting, and I find that really powerful in critiquing the social world that this novel takes place within, saying that women are property here, women can be abused, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's within the man's right to do it. And I thought that was a really powerful point that the novel sort of talked about, discussing specifically with Heathcliff and Isabella's relationship. The final one that I'm going to talk about as well, specifically with critique to the social world, was sort of not totally an example of the critique of the social world, if that makes sense, but more on the topic of the social world. So I want to talk about the Moors. I think the Moors are a big part of this novel, and the Moors are sort of an allegory as a place for Catherine and Heathcliff's relationship, if you sort of look in the novel. I think there's so many parts that point to this. I think one thing that is important to note is that, how I've already discussed the fact that Heathcliff and Catherine's love can't exist within Britain's 19th century social world. So, in that same vein, the social world is represented by certain physical spaces like Thurgosh Grange and Mr. Lockwood, one of the narrators of the novel, while sort of the natural world is represented by the Moors. And I think that the Moors sort of leaves the realm of the social world for the natural world, representing a place where Catherine and Heathcliff's love can exist and can inhabit. And so the Moors can sort of be seen as an expression of societal divide, where comfort and freedom become accessible to Catherine, whereas the social world represents her as a property, as a piece of property. And so, just as much as they represent Isabella as a piece of property, so do they Catherine. And I think that this space of the Moors and its importance within the novel shows you that, and expresses the idea that there is a place where the two of them can exist, but it's not in the social world. You have to leave the social world for love to be formed, for individuals not to exist as a piece of property, but rather their own individual, thoughtful, self-expressive beings. And so I thought that the Moors just really were such a powerful place and a powerful allegory throughout the novel that get overlooked a lot. The only reason I even know about the Moors in this manner, I give all credit to my professor who discussed this. I think I never would have noticed that, or I never would have thought about that, and I never would have had that conversation internally if not for my professor. So I think that was a really important part of the novel for me. Yeah. Sorry, my camera died on me for a second there, but I'm back now. Okay, so moving on, I want to talk about the ending of the novel, and specifically the idea of vicious cycles sort of represented throughout the novel. There's also the theme of revenge that is pretty prominent within the novel, and specifically the idea of Heathcliff's revenge. So I think that with that, I want to point to a specific page where you can sort of see Heathcliff's revenge plan. I'm going to point to page 85 within my text, if I can find it. Just a specific line. This is when Heathcliff is talking with Nellie after being abused by Hindley, who is Catherine's older brother. "For shame, Heathcliff," said I. "It is for God to punish wicked people. We should learn to forgive." "No, God won't have the satisfaction that I shall," he returned. "I only wish I knew the best way. Let me alone, and I'll plan it out while I'm thinking of that. I don't feel pain." I think this is the first point within the novel that we can sort of see Heathcliff's spitefulness and his revenge, his ideas of revenge, and the fact that he knows he wants to take revenge on Hindley for the way that he has treated him throughout his entire life. I mean, let's look at Catherine. Catherine treated him not as bad, of course, but still poorly, especially in the beginning when Heathcliff was first introduced in the novel, and pinching his ears or abusing him in ways I think is very interesting. The fact that he was able to forgive her, but still have this revenge for Hindley and for Wuthering Heights as a whole. And so I think that revenge is kind of what mostly fuels the novel's narrative, specifically, obviously, against Hindley and Wuthering Heights. And with that, it sort of leads to Heathcliff's narrative throughout the novel being around revenge. You know, the reason he took over Wuthering Heights, the reason he treated Hareton Earnshaw, who is Hindley's son, in the manner that he did. All of that is really important for understanding Heathcliff's behavior and the novel's ending. So a prominent moment, knowing all of this information, within the novel is when it's towards the end. Heathcliff, after seeing Hareton and Catherine II, so Catherine's daughter, bonding and sort of becoming closer, he sees himself and Catherine I within the two of them in that specific moment, and he sort of denounces his revenge plot. And so it's on page 300, and I'm going to skip around a bit because it's a long chunk. "They lifted their eyes together to encounter Mr. Heathcliff. Perhaps you have never remarked that their eyes are precisely similar, and they are those of Catherine Earnshaw. I suppose this resemblance disarmed Mr. Heathcliff. He walked to the hearth in evident agitation, but it quickly subsided as he looked at the young man, or should I say, altered its character, for it was there yet. He took the book by the hand and glanced to open a page, and then he returned it without any observation, merely signed Catherine away. Her companion lingered but very little behind her, and as I was about to depart also, but he bid me to sit still. It is a poor conclusion, is it not? He observed, having brooded a while on the scene while he had just witnessed. An absurd termination to my violent exertions. I get levers and mattocks to demolish the two houses, and train myself to be capable of workings like Hercules. And when everything is ready and in my power, I will find the lift to slate off either roof has vanished. My old enemies have not beaten me. Now would be the precise time to revenge myself on their representatives. I could do it, and none could hinder me. But where is the use in it? I don't care for striking. I can't take the trouble to raise my hand. That sounds as if I have been laboring the whole time, only to exhibit a fine trait of magnanimity. It is far from being the case. I have lost the faculty of enjoying their destruction, and I am too idle to destroy all for nothing. This moment, to me, felt like the moment that he sort of denounces his revenge plot, and where he finally decides that he no longer is seeking revenge because he's seeing himself and Catherine in their children. Well, not their children, because Linton Heathcliff is his child, but he's seeing himself and he's seeing the repetitive cycle of revenge and love not being fulfilled within them, and he doesn't want to be the reason that that love goes unfulfilled, and so he denounces his revenge. He says that he doesn't want it anymore, and that he can't do it himself. He can't find enjoyment in their destruction, and that all of his work and effort to become almost Hercules-like strength of revenge was for nothing. And so I think this is a moment when you see that idea of the revenge vicious cycle ending, and some could argue here that this is proof that the revenge plot and the revenge cycle that takes place within the novel ends. But I think you could also argue that, does the cycle of abuse and revenge ever really end in the novel? You could take this as evidence of yes, but my honest answer, no. I don't think that the cycle of revenge and of abuse, specifically those two topics within the novel, ended with Heathcliff denouncing his plot of revenge. I think that the issue again goes back to the world system, and that man's education into the world system and the social structures of society is where the problems arose. And the whole novel is sort of pointing to the social world as the problem, and so by Catherine II in the end educating Hareton Earnshaw as she was doing in that scene, she's implementing him into the same social world where abuse and revenge stemmed from. And you also look at page, 270 of the novel, where Catherine II literally says something about this. She says here, after being treated poorly by Mr. Heathcliff, which was a lot, "Mr. Heathcliff, you will have nobody to love you, and however miserable you make us, we shall still have the revenge of thinking that your cruelty arises from greater misery. You are miserable, are you not? Lonely like the devil and envious like him. Nobody loves you. Nobody will cry for you when you die. And I wouldn't be you." And so I think here you can sort of see the cycle of revenge repeating itself within Catherine II. And I think that the way that she goes about getting her revenge is through the education of Hareton Earnshaw and through sort of the loving him in a way. But I think that in doing that, she's introducing Hareton Earnshaw to the social world and the social system that starts the cycle of abuse all over again. So although she might think that she's getting her revenge on Heathcliff, she's just repeating another revenge and abuse cycle within it and creating the same patterns that led to the same problems within the beginning of the novel. I think that this sort of marks the moment where you think you've left it and you think you've sort of it's like leaving the Matrix. You think you've left the Matrix, but do you ever really know if you have? Can you ever really be sure? And I think that this is that moment that it leaves it up to the reader, and it leaves it up to each individual to sort of understand how they interpret it. And so the way I interpret it and the way I understood it was, no, she doesn't get to leave. She's fulfilling her destiny and creating these repetitive cycles and following the same prophecy that her mother and Heathcliff fell to, and restarting that cycle of abuse because of the social world and social structures in place. And at the end of the day, that is what needs to be changed. And I think that it's such a powerful novel because it understands that there is no end until we address the root problem, which is the social world. And I think it's something that makes Emily Bronte such a genius within this novel that really struck me the second time I read this around and really became way more prevalent to me in a way that I think empowered me in a sense and made me feel as if I was more enlightened and I understood more of the novel. With this in mind, I actually would like to just do some concluding remarks about this novel and sort of my big takeaways from it. And I think that sort of the first takeaway I took from this novel is that each time you reread it, you learn something completely new. You learn something new about the novel, you learn something new about the characters, about the individual self within it. And I think that it's really important to reread and not take everything by first glance and try and go deeper with it. I think that that's a really important part of the novel that they're really saying. You know, you can look at my notes on top of notes here and you can understand that my perspective changed and I understood more and I grew just as the novel stays the same. I can grow around it. I think that my second remark that I would say is that to understand that it's okay to have a different opinion, especially when you're reading a novel like this, you know. It's okay to have varying thoughts. It's okay to disagree with someone. It's okay to agree with them as well, you know. You don't need to agree with the whole room. Be original. You can learn something new that way. You know, when I was reading this novel, I felt like I didn't always agree with the sort of like generalized ideas about Wuthering Heights. You know, I didn't think it was a love story. I felt that the novel didn't really end on a happy note. Obviously it didn't. I feel like no one who reads it thinks that. But I just think that it's okay to not go with what everyone else says and to have your own original ideas. It's okay to have your own thoughts. It's okay to say your mind. It's okay to disagree. I think it's important to remember that you're allowed to have your own opinions and that it's not weird or uncool to do that. And just talk about books, have conversations, disagree with people, share your thoughts. I hope you enjoyed my review. I hope you learned something new from it. I hope it made sense. This is my first time ever filming something like this, so I'm rambling a bit. I hope I'm not contradicting myself in some of my words. I hope you enjoyed, but keep reading, keep rereading, learn something new, disagree with someone, have a conversation about a novel. Just learn. Yeah. Thank you. I hope you have a good day.